And if your kid is like driving you nuts because they are not taking risks and they seem to be, afraid of failure, and that, by the way, that sometimes looks like laziness, right? Even though it's underneath the surface, not at all laziness. You know, ask yourself, like, maybe they are not confident because they haven't had a string of experiences to make them confident, right? So here again, the person versus the situation. Like maybe your underconfident child, which is a person, is that way because of series of situations. And then you have to think of, and all of the great coaches and teachers do this. You kind of just like engineer these, small wins where, you make things like bite size enough that there can be a few at bats and a few hits.
Angela, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Shane. I'm so glad to be here.
I'm curious about human behavior. Can we explore a bit to what extent our behavior is predictable versus what extent it's situational?
So the person versus situation debate is the question that you're asking about. And, you could say that this has been the central question in all of psychology for as long as we've had psychology, right? And then if you want to predate it even more, you could say philosophy has grappled. You could argue that there are other questions as well, but this is central. Am I generous because I'm a generous person? Or am I generous because of the exigencies of the situation, and the contrary too, right? So when you witness a selfish behavior, is that because the person is selfish or because of context factors? And I've been thinking about this, Shane, for, well, not since the beginning of time, but since the beginning of my time. um, uh, and as a psychologist, one of the first things I learned about was this war. I mean, have you ever heard this expression, the person versus situation war in psychology?
No, never.
So, uh, it was about 1968, so I could be off by a year or so. But Walter Mischel, one of the greatest psychologists to ever live, who lived into his 90s, passed away a couple years ago. He wrote a book, and it was called Personality and Assessment. It was really like a monograph, like a really, really long essay, but it was like 300 pages, so let's call it a book. And young Walter, at that point, it was like 2 years before I was born, asked the question, how consistent is our behavior across situations? Because that, of course, would be an argument for the person, right? Shane is generous when he goes to buy coffee in the morning. Shane is generous to his family. Shane is generous to his friends. Shane is generous to, a random person at the bus stop. And when he looked at the available data, of which there was dramatically less, because data seems to have exploded exponentially in behavioral science. But at least circa 1968, Walter was able to squint and say, look, if you look at all the available data, not so much is the answer to how much consistency there is across situations, which is an argument in favor of situations over the person. And the correlation that he observed across situations had like a maximum of about 0.3. And sometimes people call this like the 0.3 ceiling, right? So if I observe somebody at home versus at work, the correlation in a data set of lots of people who are observed in both situations might only approach 0.3. So the reason why it's a war, you need an enemy to have a war, right? So on the other side of this debate, actually, even in the 1960s, and you can find these like early back and forth arguments. If you go back far enough into Google Scholar, you had people who said that's ridiculous. Of course, there's such a thing as a generous person. You're not going to marry a random person. You marry them because of their character, because of their personality. So it can't be that we are so chameleon-like that there's no consistency within us. There's no such thing as our character. And around that decade or so, there was also this, this research on the Big Five. Now, I want to ask you. This is like a psychology quiz. Like, Shane, have you ever heard of the Big Five?
No. Are these the Cialdini sort of liking loving principles, or are these something completely different?
No, no. The big five refer to the five personality factors that
No.
are kind of like the north, south, and east and west of personality, except for their five, not four, inconveniently. But the big five are it's a taxonomy of personality traits. So extroversion, uh, conscientiousness, agreeableness, openness to experience, and emotional stability. And there are these like five, kind of, you can think of them just to mix metaphors here, like as continents, and then like specific character or personality traits would just be, on these continents. So like grit, which is something I study, would be like on the conscientiousness continent, but sitting next to self-control and punctuality and politeness, etc. And the reason I bring all this up, I mean, uh, it's not that everybody has to like take psych 1, but I think it's really interesting that around the time that people began to ask seriously and interrogate the data on whether it was the person or the situation that determined behavior, this kind of contrary to Walter tradition was emerging, which is to say, yes, there is such a thing as personality. And furthermore, we can actually give you a map of human personality that is consistent across culture and across time. So children seem to, have, characters or personality attributes that could be classified into the big five. You can say of a child, like, oh, that child is like pretty high on extroversion, relatively low on conscientiousness, kind of in the middle on emotional stability, et cetera, et cetera. So I guess where I would say that we've advanced to in 2020 is the following resolution of this debate or this war, which is that it is both the personality of the person and their situation that determines what they will do. And what's more, I can say that the wrong way to think about it is like 80-20, 70-30, 40-60. Because what really your personality and your situation are like, it's like a conversation where the personality of the person actually changes the situation. Conscientious people like select into jobs that require conscientiousness, but then the situation kind of talks back to the personality and shapes the person. So after you've been in a job that requires like lots of detail orientation and diligent methodical work, like you yourself after years will be shaped by it and so forth. So that was a very long answer to your question, but I believe that the situation matters. I believe that we do have character strengths or personality traits. And I think there's a lot more complexity to get into, but I think the metaphor that we want to use is that there's a conversation going on between ourselves and the circumstances in which we are.
And is that a conscious conversation, or is that a conversation between our unconscious brain and our circumstance or our physical environment? Or
Well, now that you got me thinking historically, right? So I'm 50. I've been alive a half century, and in that time, the personality, this debate between the person and the situation happened, and kind of was resolved. I think, and at the same time, another I think important discovery or advance was made in the same time period in psychology, which is the basically the affirmation that Freud was right. I mean, Freud was wrong about a lot of things, but one thing he was very right about is that so much of um, our behavior and even our emotion and our motivation happens below the surface of consciousness. And the idea that we do things and not always knowing that we do them is important. But it's not just that, insight, because you could say like, oh, really? It took Freud and 50 years of science after Freud to figure that. It's like how much of our behavior and our emotion and motivation could be going on without our conscious awareness. So I do think a lot of the conversation between who we are and our circumstances is happening without our being aware. Although you can bring our awareness to our behavior. That's where Freud was wrong, by the way. Freud was like, you'll never know. It's under the floorboards, and you can't pry open the floorboards in the basement of your mind, no matter what tools you have. But there, I think he was wrong.
but if our situation and our environment can speak to our subconscious mind, which will influence our behavior, how do we consciously design a situation to the extent we can, or a physical environment to the extent we can, to put us on the path to success?
So here's where, there are many people I would like to resurrect just so we can have a really great dinner party conversation or write a paper together. And Freud would be, close to the top of the list. And I would love to say this to Freud, but I would also like to see what Freud would have said back. So Freud designed psychoanalysis around the assumption that you can't actually think directly about these problems, right? So say you're like, really compulsively, checking the stove every time, like you have OCD, right? Or a version of OCD, because most psychopathologies are continuous, not categorical. So say you're on the continuum toward obsessive compulsive disorder, and you have these obsessive thoughts that you left the stove on, and then you find yourself going back and like checking, 64, 89, however many times a day. So Freud might say that like what we really need to do is meet 5 days a week, and you tell me about your dreams, and you talk about your father, and then you project onto me your feelings about your father, and then like several years later, maybe, but probably not, we will make some progress, because of course I can't just say, hey, let's talk about the stove thing.
Right.
Like, what's going on? I think that this dialogue that happens below the surface of consciousness can be raised, most of it, to conscious awareness, and then you could just like literally have a conversation like we're having, and then you can think like, hey, what is it about my job that's sort of bringing out the worst in me? Like, let me think about that. I'll talk to my spouse about it, and then proceed from there.
How do you think he would have responded to that?
Well, Freud's reasoning was, famously like non-falsifiable, right? So he would probably, well, first of all, I'm a woman, so he would have wondered about my wandering uterus, which was one of his lovely ideas, that like women who had what he called neuroses were afflicted by a wandering uterus. Which is a lovely image. If he listened to me and like and took the argument seriously, I think people in his day must have brought this up, right? Like, wait a second, why can't I just talk about my problems? He probably would have said that you think you're getting to the root problem, but you never really will, because it's your id, right? Your id is in conflict, with your ego, or and you just like you can never really like address your id. So it may have been, one of those dinner party conversations that ends in argument and people leave before dessert.
And a lot of wine.
Yes, maybe if I plied him with wine, it would go better.
I'm going to switch gears a little bit here. History shows us that the best opportunities come from sort of seizing and spotting opportunities, and they don't come in the good times, they come in the bad times. And it seems like an art. So if you follow that, then there's a staggering advantage to be gained by positioning yourself to capitalize on bad times. And one of the ways that we can do that is our mindset. If you think about the mindsets required for this, what comes to mind?
So I want to make sure we go back. If you could stick a pin in the idea that there's more opportunity in times of crisis than there is in times of flourishing. I would like to just question that a bit.
All right.
Is that true? Can we go back to that now first? And
yeah,
then we'll go
I mean, we can explore that.
How do you mean that? And it's not that I disagree. I just want to know, because you seem really certain about that. So what do you mean?
I think that, businesses, people tend to put themselves in positions to succeed during good times and bad times. And if you can succeed during the bad times, you really thrive because everybody else is reeling. Like if we look at, and I'm speaking in a business context more so than anything else, because you look at Rockefeller, right? He went through 3 financial crashes. All of them, he came out much stronger than he went into them, in part because he had this optionality, and he, you could say he intelligently prepared for these situations. And while everybody else was panicking and losing their cool, he was able to stay calm and collected, which became a huge advantage to him, I think, in terms of like how he went about that. I'm curious, like maybe I'm completely wrong.
No, that's really interesting. Of course, I think of things more as a psychologist. So I thought you meant like in times of personal crisis, there's more opportunity than there is in times of.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, and that may be. I just want to add a footnote to that, which is, so I don't know. I'd have to think about that more. I will say that I've worked with some great coaches, right? So professional coaches of professional athletes, um, uh, and more than one of them has said something that surprised me, which is when we start talking about like how to develop their players and like especially their younger players. So usually when you recruit a professional athlete, they're like technically still in adolescence,
Yeah.
psychologically anyway. Brain's still developing, prefrontal cortex not quite mature. Anyway, it sometimes gets them in a lot of trouble. And I thought the whole conversation would be like, tell me what to do when my players are having a bad day. And actually,
Mm-hmm.
one of the things that surprised me most was that so often it's the players who are having a really good year that actually end up, for a variety of reasons, like, like that's its own kind of crisis in a way.
Tell me more
Um,
about that.
well, I think there are probably two. This is me speculating now beyond their comments. So I'll start with some things that have been said, but then I had a different idea as well. So one is that when things are like really going well, you get picked 1 and 2 in the draft, like you're going to be MVP, etc. You can just see how that could lead to all kinds of problems. From the trivial, like you get just lavished with attention on social media and people like throwing themselves at you and not telling you what they really think anymore because they want to be a hanger on in your entourage. But also I think it creates a lot of fear for people because now you have everything to lose. And
Right.
I do think that like some of the most successful people, right, like the people like Kobe Bryant, like were able to maintain an underdog mindset, or even Tom Brady, right? We're long
Mm,
past the time where you could actually legitimately say that you're an underdog, right? And maybe for Kobe Bryant, that would be never, right? Because he never really was an underperformer in any sense, right? So I think the idea that like failure is an opportunity to either thrive or not, but also success has its own, I think, challenges. The thing I would amend to that, or I guess append to that, is that one of the things that I really admire about outstanding performers is that they really are never done. They're the opposite of complacent, and I think one of the hidden dangers of success is that you stop kind of like working as hard as you really need to. I mean, that's kind of related to the first thing that we're saying, but just like you know, like there are people that I know who really want to win their second Nobel Prize, and the people who are like just uh, tireless so they learn as much in bad years as they do in good years, and I think that's maybe they're perennial learners. So anyway, so that was all a bit of a digression. You wanted to know about the mindsets
No,
that
hold on. Before we come
yeah.
to this mindset, how do we maintain that underdog mentality in light of success? Like, how does Tom Brady, maybe different for him, right? Because he has this Michigan experience that totally changes his
Yeah,
life.
which was decades ago, right?
But
I
he's got
mean,
a
he
chip on
keeps
his shoulder, and he still
yeah,
has a
but
chip
how
on
do you
his
keep it on
shoulder.
your shoulder, right? Like we can explain the first time he had a chip on his shoulder, right? But like I don't know, like after the second Super Bowl win, like what? So how it's both why and how. I think the why is a lot of these high performing athletes, but actually high performers in all fields, chefs and entrepreneurs and so like what's fascinating to me is like when I talk to them, it's very clear that they are at some level manipulating themselves you
Mm,
I'm sure watched the Michael Jordan documentary Last Dance, and just like if you think about Michael Jordan, basically he must have not a stupid guy, right? An
yeah.
extremely intelligent person and very psychologically intuitive. I know, okay, I don't know, I'm guessing that he used certain like tricks to get himself riled up, and he kind of knew he was using them, right? Like he would pick on a certain argument that like he had with the opponent team or opponent player, in the 24 hours leading up to a game, just sort of like looking for something to, and so it wasn't happenstance. He was like manipulating himself. So I think this underdog mindset where you like keep the chip on your shoulder is partly, if you ask why, it's like because they know it improves their performance, right? So then you could ask the question, I think an equally interesting question is like, why doesn't everybody do that?
Yeah.
Right? Like only some people do that. And here's something that I have long speculated. Maybe I know you have a lot of like economically oriented, if not economically trained people listening to you, Shane, and maybe one of them will email me and ask to work on this. So here's something that I have observed in my data that I have an idea for why it is, but I haven't figured out a way to test it. So talent measured by IQ scores or objective measures of physical ability are not very correlated with grit. The correlations usually hover around zero. And by the way, I should define grit. Grit is the tendency to pursue long-term goals over years and years with passion and perseverance. So this quality of grit is correlated about zero with measures of ability. Sometimes it's actually negative, actually. So at West Point, for example, the higher your SAT score, the lower, statistically, on average, your grit score. So then you ask the question, why, right? And the reason I'm surprised by that is just rationally speaking, if you're really good at something, if every time you try for an hour, you just get a huge return on investment because you're really talented, like, shouldn't you be the person who works the longest and the hardest? Because like your ROI is awesome. But in fact, you get this zero and sometimes negative correlation. So here's my speculation. I think that the reason why that is that for the vast majority of people, let's say for 99% of people, you're just trying to get to a certain, like threshold of excellence. Like how many people, when they're already getting a 99 in a course, right? Or frankly, a 93, whatever the watermark is for getting an A, right? How many people would keep trying and really try, like just try it, like the marginal gain of knowledge is like no small, there's no diminishing marginal return. I'd say 99% of people are like, oh, you only try up to the point where you get the A or you make a certain, whatever amount of money or you get a certain amount of accomplishment. And then you withdraw effort, accordingly. And therefore, the really, really smart people who have like a really high ROI are like those taxi drivers in the famous study who like on a rainy day, even though they can earn more money, so they should stay out for like an 18-hour shift, like they actually go home early because they make their till, right? They're like, oh, made it to I made my some amount of money, I'll go home after 3 hours. The 1% of people, I mean, making up numbers here, but the rare individual is never sated, and there's no diminishing marginal return for achievement or understanding or learning. And so they're the Abby Wambachs, like they're the Tom Brady's, like they're the Kevin Durant's, they're the Jeff Bezos's. And I think that satisficing is a description of most people, and maximizing without end is a description of the people that I study.
Are those people born or are they made through life experiences? Like how do we
What
yeah,
do
let's
you
start
think?
with that and then maybe like how do we develop it to the extent that it is developable? I think, a lot of it is driven by life experience. I mean, this is my personal take,
Yeah, I
right?
mean,
Like,
I would love to hear what you think, and I wonder, yeah, I would like to like know what you think of yourself, like whether like how
oh
you are in those
God.
dimensions, and or whether that was kind of nature or nurture for you.
I'm very much of the Will Smith mindset, which is, I'll race you on a treadmill and,
And you will not get off.
I'm just gonna pass out before I give up. And I have no idea where that comes from, but it's really good for grinding. It's been great.
Were
Uh,
you always like that?
yeah, I think so. And I don't know
Hmm.
why. And
Hmm. Doesn't that lead you to a nature narrative?
well, sort of, but then I have 2 kids, and one of them is very much not like that. He's very much like, "Oh, I can do 30 seconds of work and get a 70, or I can do 5 hours of work and get a 90. Like, why would I do 5 hours of work? I'm content with this
Tell him my
70."
satisficing hypothesis and see what he
Yeah.
thinks.
So that I mean, that's
But
my
your kids have
take.
different genes, by the way. So
I'm not the expert here. So
yeah,
you
okay. You can turn the mic back to me. I think that's interesting. The nature nurture um, debate, which has been going on for more than 50 years, right? So we were talking about personality assessment, and that was published about 50 years ago. But it was about 150 years ago that Francis Galton, who was, by the way, a complete asshole. Like he was a eugenicist, racist, not nice person, terrible person. But he did have a way with words, and he coined the phrase, I believe, nature versus nurture. He was staunchly in the nature camp, by the way, which drove his eugenicist beliefs about,
But hold on,
about,
can we
yeah,
just broaden this nature nurture thing
yeah,
to begin with? So, nature would sort of be, in my understanding, just to make sure we're on the same page, is you like your
mm,
genes. This is what you're born with genetically. It's the mutations and your parents and the combination of your history. Nurture, there's two types of nurture. There's chance and there's chosen, right? Chance
mm,
is like what country I'm born into, what my parents do for a living, what my, you know, what my situation is, what my environment is
your
like, what's
circumstances that just
my zip
happen.
code, right? Like I had no
Hmm.
say in any of that. That's all
Right.
luck. But then at some point, there's like a chosen nurture that kicks in, which is like you're an adult and there's probably no light switch that like flips, right? There's some people that will probably flip at 16, some people that might never flip, but you have this ability to take
You have agency to
control.
change your situation, right?
Yeah,
You're like, hey, these friends are really not good for me. I'm not going to hang out with them anymore. Yeah, so you can see how immediately this gets very complicated, right? And you can see how immediately you're like, hold on, like nature versus nurture sounds so elegant and like, but wait, that's just, now I have two kinds of nurture. Like, what do I do with that? And let me say that when Francis Galton coined this term, and by the way, his cousin, uh half cousin, was Charles Darwin, right? So just to put this in history, this is well before there was a real appreciation of genes. um,
right.
so it was only kind of like this idea that something was transmitted from generation to generation. And um, and I think you're right to complicate things. And my desire always, when somebody asks me about this, is to shove as much information into their heads as possible. Usually that's not that much, right? Usually people are like, well, I just want to know, like, is it nature versus nurture? So I was like, how about this? First complication, it's nature and nurture, right? So
Yep.
step one is, it is not either or, it is definitely both and. You have two kids, I have two kids. Our kids inherited DNA from their biological parents, right? Uh, they are absolutely influenced by that DNA. I mean, there is no characteristic at all, psychological or otherwise. Your risk of heart disease, your preference for broccoli, whether you like to talk a lot at parties, whether you pray or not. There are literally published studies on all of those things, like documenting that if you are a twin, you are more likely to be like your sibling than if you are not a twin, right? Because, at least I'm talking about identical twins, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the nature part. But for the very same characteristics, which is like all characteristics, right? There's also evidence from the same twin studies, by the way, that nurture matters. And in these studies, very often nurture is just like, they take the nature part, which they can back into statistically, and then just like nurture is kind of everything else. So it kind
Okay.
of puts into one group the things that you had some control over, and then the things that you didn't. Although, okay, step two is like, okay, now we say like there's probably a conversation going on between nature and nurture, because a very conscientious person says, I'm going to go to summer school this summer and get away from my good for nothing friends.
Yeah.
But also, the kind of kid who chooses to go to summer school when they're 16 probably is being influenced by their genes. So it quickly becomes extremely complex. And then there are things that you probably don't want to talk about more, like epigenetics. And anyway, it gets very complex. I don't know that most people like want to shove this much information into their minds. So sometimes I just stop at kind of like, it's complicated and it's both.
No, I want to actually explore it a little more, especially on the fulcrum of there are things that we can't control, but there are things that we can control. And what are those things that we can control? And what are the, like, you don't choose who your parents are, but as an adult, you can choose who your exemplars are. You can choose who the people you model yourself after are.
Yeah, and actually, let's go back to parents for a moment, because it's so often joked like you can't choose your parents, but you can choose your friends, whatever. You can't choose your parents, but you know what? What the fact is that you can kind of choose, not choose entirely. I don't want to overplay this, but when a child acts out, and it's just like a pain in the ass, it evokes a certain kind of parenting behavior. So it's not just that, it's not exactly that simple, even for parenting, right?
Right.
Like if you're extremely agreeable and grateful and empathic as a child, you will evoke a different kind of parenting from the same parent who
Right.
would have a very different response if you were ungrateful, callous, unempathetic, mean, right? So that's been one of the things that, like, there are parents who, God bless them, like they do have kids who biologically, genetically, like are inclined to be like really difficult. And
Yeah.
one of the breakthrough discoveries in that like area of psychopathology is that yes, there's a genetic component, et cetera. Yes, parenting does influence, like if you have abusive parents, and so here's the complication. When you like ask those not so great to be with kids to be in a room with like a total stranger who obviously is not, like they're not their parent, right? You can get those kids evoke a kind of like strict, harsh disciplinary, because the adult is just like, shut up, like sit in that chair, stop throwing things. So it's complicated, and I don't want to say that we can control everything, but you can see how like almost anything that we say ends up being slightly wrong,
Yeah.
right? So you were saying there's parenting, which maybe largely at least outside your control, and then there are things that are clearly in your control, like you could not buy Oreos when you go to the supermarket. If you choose to buy Oreos, you're going to be in a different situation. You're going to be in your house with Oreos, as opposed to in your house without Oreos, right? So
And that
I
kind
have
of
done,
comes
yeah.
back to being conscientious about your situations that you're put in, because now you're choosing to overrule perhaps your nature, your nature with your nurture. Your chosen nurture is choosing to put yourself in a situation that's more likely to be on a path to success.
Yeah, I mean, like, I hope this conversation is long enough that I'm going to talk about agency and
Yeah.
control and the mindset that gets you to say, like, wait a second, I got a little bit of, I have a little like control here. I think I can do something, which I do think is the mindset of a gritty person, and usually a high achieving person. And I hope our conversation is long enough to address, I think, a critique of that stance, which is like for example, I have been criticized for ignoring poverty, race, and structural um, lack of opportunity, and overemphasizing like what a human being can do with their circumstances. So hopefully our conversation will extend long enough to address those critiques, which I think have a legitimacy to them that I want to like try
Yeah,
to
we'll definitely come
paraphrase.
back to that. Yeah.
Okay, so let's start with the mindset of like, hey, I can change something. I've done these research studies on this self control technique called situation modification. And this work was done with collaborators, including James Gross at Stanford. And James Gross actually originally and mostly studies emotion. And one of the things that's interesting about regulating your anger is if you have a bad temper, or your sadness if you tend toward melancholy, or your happiness if you want more of that, or I guess if you wanted less of that, is that people can, use these like sort of mental strategies, like what I pay attention to, how I'm going to frame things, my self-talk, but also you can just change your actual situation. So, for example, if you constantly get into arguments at Thanksgiving with your brother-in-law, then maybe you should sit at the other end of the table, or like not go to Thanksgiving with your brother-in-law, or like make sure that like you're watching football while your brother-in-law is like cutting up the pie, right? So we extended that in a study of middle school. Well, actually, we've done it in all different age groups. I'll tell you about a study we did with high school students where we randomly assigned high school students to watch this little video. It was about 5 minutes long. And then we told them some other things, but the intervention wasn't very long. And we were like, you can change your situation. Like people think when they have to exercise self-control to like study or do well in school, they think it's all willpower. But like actually, like you could, for example, put your phone in another room. Like you could make sure that you study in a place that like people aren't walking into and out of all the time. So in that study, there was a control group that learned about willpower and how important it is to like, use willpower to accomplish your goals. And then there was a a neutral control group. And what we found is that the condition that increased academic goal attainment best was the one where you just explain to kids, like, hey, you can modify your situation. Um, and I think that idea that like your situation isn't just like fixed or set, but something you can agentically, intentionally modify is one of the most important lessons that you could learn in life.
I love that. I think that there a lot of people are passive about life. It's like life just happens to them, and things just happen to them, and it's sort of like you can um, put that in the victim mentality sort of mindset, but it's deeper than that in a way, right? It's like I have no agency over anything. It's not necessarily about the story. It's just sort of like this general passiveness too. And I believe in a very active life, right?
Where
Which
did
is,
you learn that? Like, why do you think you have come out on that end of the continuum?
I don't know. I mean, I first got that phrasing, I think it was from Graham Duncan, in a conversation we had in New York. And he just sort of recounted this story to me about one of his friends actually was driving with this portfolio manager. And I think he actually wrote about this on his blog too. But they were driving, and then this car swerved out and almost hit him. And the guy driving the car was like, why does this stuff always happen to me? And it was just a very revealing sort of mindset, right? And it comes back to sort of that question, which is like, what are the mindsets that are going to enable us to capitalize on life, in part in bad situations, capitalize on bad, capitalize on good, intelligently prepare to put us on the path to success?
So I don't know the rest of the poem, but right, I'm the captain of my fate. I am the master of my soul. Right, and then there are people who are like, I'm on a ship and they have no idea where it's going, and I can't, like steer it. And I think you're on to something very important. And I guess I have a fondness for like great psychologists in their 90s, because I have been calling Al Bandura a lot. He is the psychologist at Stanford, I think he's 96 now, who coined the term self efficacy
Okay.
to describe the belief that you can do something if you try, right? So, self efficacy about physics would be like, I can learn physics if I tried, right? And I had this conversation with him, like a couple weekends ago, actually, where I asked him, I was like, Al, you've spent your whole life studying self-efficacy, but there was this other person whose like, name is spelled Rotter, but I think it's like Dutch or German. Anyway, so I'm going to mispronounce it as Rotter. But Rotter studied locus of control, and locus of control was to me like super similar. So I asked Al, like, what's the difference? Because in locus of control theory, you either have an internal locus of control or an
Right.
external locus of control, right? So life kind of happens to you, or that would be the external, or like you're in control. And he said, oh, there's a very important difference. He said, I'm more interested in saying that like I can control my behavior, not necessarily that behavior is going to like magically make everything the way I want.
Right.
What locus of control is about is more just like like in the grand scheme, is the actual outcome going to be my doing or not? Because like all I want to say is that people have agency over their behavior, over their uh, performance, not necessarily like that you're going to get hired just because you were the most qualified candidate, but that you could control like your own behavior and performance. So I think that's a very important nuance here, because I don't think that we want to teach our kids that that they have like control over like whether the coronavirus vaccine is going to be made available in their municipality, in 1 month or another, or
Right.
whether they're or whether they're going to get into a certain college, because those things are a bit downstream.
Yeah.
But where I really agree with Bandura is that that first of all, that we do have control, we do have agency, and that it's dramatically more productive to when you think about your own behavior, that you think about that you really pay attention to the things that you can control. And I wonder, you probably haven't, or maybe you're more well read than I. Have you ever heard of Howard Thurman?
No.
Okay, we need to resurrect Howard Thurman even before Freud. right?
Okay.
So Howard Thurman was like the mentor and the pastor for Martin Luther King. Jr. And Howard Thurman, I had never heard of because I'm deeply illiterate. But I was reading Arthur Ashe's memoir. So Arthur Ashe, for those who are younger than us, maybe he's a great tennis player, and I believe the only black male to win Wimbledon. So he wrote this memoir called Days of Grace, which I recommend, and in it he talks about how so important in his life was Howard Thurman. So that led me to Howard Thurman, and the reason I bring it up is that Howard Thurman has all these sermons about how there is what he would like say, like, the final consent. He was like, you cannot like change that you were born into a racist society. You cannot change that you were born into a certain family, but you can always change how you react to it, right? Like you're responsible for how you react to it. And Viktor Frankl said the same thing about his experience in the concentration camps, right? That terrible things can happen to you, over which you do not have control, but you can control your reaction. And I don't want to even say that you can control it 100%, but I do think you have some control over your reaction. And I think this agentic view is, both accurate and adaptive.
How do we as parents instill that mindset in our kids?
So I asked Al Bandura this. I said, do you think that you could learn as much from failure as you could from success, right? Because there are all these like adages and aphorisms about failure, especially in startup land. And he said, oh, this one, I 100% believe that mastery experiences, success experiences are what really build this sense of agency. He then, of course, because I know you want nuance, and you're right to want the nuance, and I think the nuance here is extremely important. If your kid has like a Teflon life where everything comes easily, in part because you make it that way, and there are a lot of parents who like sort of just make their kids' lives frictionless, right? Like, oh, you're struggling for 10 minutes, like I'll get you a $500 per hour tutor. Like, oh, your teacher's not so great, I'll get them fired. So you remove all obstacles, et cetera. That's not the kind of success experience that Al Bandura is talking about, because he's talking about success after challenge, success after struggle. So I think Al Bandura's advice is the best advice, which is the number one thing, and there's more than one thing, but the number one thing is that people develop confidence when they have struggled to overcome something and they have come out victorious. And the engineering problem for a parent is then to figure out the right size of challenge for the kid, like in the next moment in time. And I think that we often get it wrong, like the challenge is just too big, or the challenge is too small.
And then, so it's sort of monitoring and adjusting based on your particular child and the circumstances involved. How do we do it as adults? Do we seek out these opportunities to be challenged?
I think that we are benefited in large part by having a surrogate parent. I mean, what I mean by that is, whether you're 50 or 5, right? It's good to have somebody who is a little older and wiser than you, who is like helping you figure out the next challenge. And most of the people that I study, like they never get out of being mentored. Like they have a management coach, they have like a personal coach, they have a therapist, they have like the ones I'm most jealous of have a peer for whom they coach each other, right? But they have somebody who's like, you should write a book. It's like, oh no, I can't write a book. No, you should really write a book. Like, and it's that kind of challenge setting that, of course, you can try to do it on your own. But I think that we're always benefited by having like another human being whose advantages are multiple, but one of them is that they're just not us, right? So they have a psychological distance from our situation.
They have a different aperture into our situation, one that removes a lot of the nuance, and the nuance in our case might be holding us back, right?
And the ego, right? The sort of like, right? So yeah. And sometimes, the people who are looking at us have a better sense of our strengths as well, right? So Yeah, absolutely. Do you have like a Yoda?
I have a friend group that sort of like keeps me motivated and keeps me going, in part because they're just so extremely
Like
successful and
crazy
kind
successful
and
people?
amazing people, right? Like, so,
Yeah.
and that's awesome, right? Because it's not only extreme success, but it's extreme success with the right kind of, in the right way,
Yes.
or what I
Yeah.
think is the right way, which would obviously be subjective, but very kind and thoughtful and conscientious, and
Right. World
how they approach
improving.
it, right? Not the Ebenezer Scrooge type of success, which is mutually exclusive from like living a life of meaning, right? You just want to redo
Right.
at the end of your life.
Well, we
Um,
know how that ended. So,
right, exactly. I think, yeah. I'm curious as to the moment, like, when are we most likely to give up? Like, when it comes back to grit for a second, like, what are the times when we're most likely to give up? And what do we intervene in those times? Is there a mental intervention we can have with ourselves, or is there a recognition, oh, this is that point. Like, I know it's coming. I just need to get over this hump. And in part, like I see, and I know you said grit was about long term, but I
yeah.
feel like there's a lot of grit necessary in the times that we're in right now, too.
Right. This kind of like, well, time limited crisis, right?
Yeah.
It's not
But
like we hope, right?
indefinite,
Not
we
going to
don't
stay.
know
Yeah.
quite know.
It's
We know it's
indefinite,
going to end. We just don't know when.
but we don't know when. Right. Which I think, just to think about like the psychological dimensions of 2020, the uncertainty clearly amplified, all of the negative emotion, right? I think we're much better at somebody saying like, hey, you're going to have to be in quarantine for 17 days. That's going to be terrible. And then the following things are definitely going to happen to you. Brace yourself, right? Versus like you wake up and then like you don't know what's going to happen, but it's pretty bad, and then like some other bad things happen. That is, by the way, what you do to an animal if you want to induce learned helplessness, which is
Hmm.
the work of my PhD advisor Marty Seligman, where you have an animal and then you like shock them. I mean, this is his early research, and then the key is that if they experience these um, uh, traumas in an unpredictable way with like you don't know when it's going to end, you don't know when next thing's going to happen, that's when you actually get the symptoms of depression, and giving up. So anyway, 2020 has been like a learned helplessness experiment, and the suffering has been real and amplified, I think, psychologically because of that. With gritty people, I think that the well, let's start with like not even gritty people, but like when we give up and like when we're most likely to give up, and what's going on there. I think that when people say, "Oh, no, I'm not going to try anymore," there is either a lack of confidence that you can prevail, right? Like, no, I'm not going to go out for soccer again because I'll never make varsity, or like I'll never be very good. Right? That's self-efficacy. That's agency. That's Al Bandura. That's what we were just talking about. The antidote to which, by the way, as Al said, is like small mastery experiences, right? Like if you can see some progress, and there are some other sources of self-efficacy which I can sketch out if you like. But the other thing I think is that like if it's not that you can't do it, it's just that it has no value to you. Like what am I even doing? This is a stupid job. Like am I like I when I quit management consulting, and some of my best friends are management consultants, so it's not like I think it's a meaningless industry. But for me personally, who had been so interested in kids and education, I literally said out loud, if I go to my grave, like increasing the ROI for a hypodermic needle company, like I just will not feel like I fulfilled my purpose. So it couldn't have been that I didn't think I could make partner or director. I
Right.
think I could have. It was just that like that goal lost value for me. So if you ask the question like when do people quit, I think it's either because the value of the goal um, goes down for whatever reason,
Yeah.
or their belief that they can achieve it.
That's a really interesting point, right? The value of the goal goes down, but we can convince ourselves the value goes down too, right? Like that can be an objective criteria, but it can also be something that I don't want that anymore.
I think that these things are so, right. This is again, the nuance here is just accurate. when a kid like just fails math, like, for 3 marking periods in a row, very clearly on the 4th marking period, they could be like, I hate math. Math is stupid. It's like, or, is it really that? Or was that originally because like you didn't say? And the flip side of that is, I think a lot of us, I mean, gosh, talk about the unconscious. Like, how many of us like what we do because we were good at it and we got
Yeah.
praised and
Yeah. Yeah.
encouraged?
And then we like the praise, and that becomes self-reinforcing. We practice more, we get better at it. I'm curious as to, coming back to what you said earlier, what's the most credible sort of research or arguments against your research?
Well, there is a number of scholars, including Bettina Love, who have asked the question, is teaching grit anti-black? And is the whole like idea of, shining light on resilience, and this whole this whole conversation on agency, like, are we doing something dangerous here, by ignoring structural poverty, racism, et cetera, et cetera? And my first reaction, being a human being, was defensiveness. Like, what? Like, how am I racist? Like that's I think natural, but hopefully temporary. And for me, I thought like, well, I am the head of character lab. Like, it is not really a good thing to just like wallow in defensiveness, and maybe I should actually listen and read more. So I did, and we had some conversations in person, and then I read more, read Bettina's book. I read what other critics had said, and I think that the message or the perspective that's being offered has real value, and that is this: that if you are asking questions about like underachievement and closing the achievement gap, et cetera, and the antidote that's offered is like, well, we should teach kids about growth mindset and grit and agency, then you might be overlooking the massive problem that stands in the way, much more so, which is terrible, like lack of resources, and that's such an abstraction, like terrible classrooms, like terrible curriculum, no computers, like none of the things that your kids and my kids have. So I think that's an important message. I would like to think that we can accommodate both of these perspectives. I mean, almost always the answer is both and in some version. And to me, this goes all the way back to your first question about the person and the situation, right? So, a child's life is not just something that they have complete control over. And I would hope that like all children, not just Black children or brown children, but like literally all children, are helped to learn some of the things that you and I learned and we're not born with, like knowing how to set a goal, make a plan, figuring out how to take an optimistic, growth oriented stance toward adversity, understanding like how to think about stress in ways that are adaptive, modify your situation. I mean, like those have to be part of personal development. And so I try to say both and in a way that first of all doesn't confuse people to no end, and also that kind of honors this perspective, which has a lot of value to it.
Is there anything that you've learned significantly post writing your book on grit that you think should be added to the conversation?
One thing that I think is a continual surprise to me is that I'm a university professor, so my students are between the ages of 18 and 22. And when you just think of the word grit and you think of like what people need to learn, you think they need to learn about resilience and hard work, about how to practice on your weaknesses and get feedback, et cetera. And those things are all true. But honestly, the Ivy League students that I teach are pretty good at all of those things already. And I can help them sharpen a little bit and strengthen a little bit. But the other half of my class, I teach this class called Grit Lab, is on passion. And I find that many, many young people are struggling much more with the direction in their life than the determination. that they need to bring to that pursuit. So, questions of like even basic questions like, what am I interested in? Right? Like how could you not know what you're interested in? I will tell you that I have young people in my office hours who say like, I literally can't tell you what I'm interested in. Like, I don't know. Help me figure that out.
Let's talk about that for a second. I mean, how would you answer the question about should we follow our passion? Should we not?
I don't think the word follow, the verb follow, is the right verb.
Okay.
So,
What's the right verb?
right, because you say to this like 18-year-old who's like, I don't know what I'm interested in. Okay, 22. Let's make it a 22-year-old senior who's like, oh my God, like I see adulthood on the horizon, fast approaching, and I don't know what I want to do. Right. And then if I say to them, my advice to you is to follow your passion. Oh, like how's that helpful? They don't know where it is, or what it is. So the verb I prefer is develop, because I do think that if I even kind of like retrospectively think about my relationship with psychology, like Shane, like if I went to Google Scholar and you picked like a random article from a random year in a random journal on something about psychology, there's a very good chance that I'm going to be fascinated by it, right? I'm like, God, is that how the visual system works? Like, wait, what's the difference between short term and long term memory? Like, blows my mind, right? Now, that is me now, right? So you could say, like, Angela followed her passion for psychology. But there was a time in my life where I didn't even know what psychology was at all. And there was a time in my life where, like, this romance was very, very fledgling, right? And it could have gone in lots of different directions, but it deepened and deepened and deepened and it got more mature. And like a marriage, right? Like, your relationship with your passion actually evolves over time. So to the terrified 22-year-olds, or frankly, probably there's some terrified 32-year-olds or whatever on this conversation with us, I would say to you, like, if you change the verb from follow to develop, right, it gives you a little bit of a clue as to what you need to do, which is you need to like start dating some things, right? And then like, go on a second date with the ones where you're like, I don't know, kind of like you. And then allow this relationship to evolve over what might take years. And not expect to have the relationship that, like, if I think about my own husband, Jason, right? My relationship to my husband today is just oceans deeper than when I first met him, and I was like, "Oh my God, he's so cute." Right? So I think that that's the process. And if I had known that when I was 22, I think I would have like relaxed a little bit, because basically I
Right.
spent like a whole decade just tortured that I didn't know what my calling was.
And does some of that come back to what you said earlier about early successes and then feeling like progress, and the progress becomes passion, and then the passion becomes developed instead of followed, but it becomes your pursuit, like those early victories, that early mentor, that early introduction becomes so key, which also places the role on teachers and professors so much too, right?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's not only what you're good at, right? I sat down on the subway, it's something like 15 years ago, but I won't forget it. Next to this guy, it was like a really long subway ride. I don't know, I was going to the Bronx or something. Anyway, it was in New York, and I was sitting next to this guy, and I struck up a conversation. He was a computer programmer, and what I learned in that conversation is that he was really good at computer programming, and he hated it. And I kept arguing back with this guy, total stranger, but I was like, how can that be? Like, people are good at what they like and they like what they're good at. And he was like, not me. Like, I'm really, really, really good at this, which is why I do it. And it makes a living. And I really don't like it. So I don't want to say it's only what you're good at, right? There's more than that to what you like, but it does play a huge role. And when
Yeah.
I think about my sort of, luck in having early wins, so my first research paper in psychology, my mentor, Marty Seligman, said, you should write this up and you should send it to psychological science. And I was
Yeah.
like, writing it down on my notepad, psychological science, right? I was like, okay, right. So I write up my study, I send it to psychological science. About 2 days later or something, I get this email back to like, great. articles accepted, got a couple like little revisions, but and so that was like my idea of what it was like to be an academic psychologist. I now know, I don't even know if I've gotten anything ever published in psychological science since then. I may not have, but like I now know that it's incredibly hard to get in. And, if I had had like a series of fails, right? Early, like,
Yeah.
would I be here? I don't know.
That's interesting. Back to the passion thing. My friend Naval Ravikant has I'm going to butcher this quote or phrase, but it's sort of like, do what is play for you, but work for others. And then that's how you can sort of like, where are those things? Because now you're leveraging also the need to make a career out of it and all of that stuff. I think that's really interesting.
Shane, that quote though, like, which I love, you couldn't have butchered it that much. That was a good one. I like that a lot. I recently was interviewing Alex Rodriguez, A-Rod. Actually, he was being interviewed by students in my class, Grit Lab. And he said, I am a hard worker. Everyone will tell you I'm hard worker. He's like, I feel like I haven't worked a day in my life.
Yeah.
Right. He's like, I can't believe I get to do that. And that must be more than just like, I'm good at it. So I do think there's something about like having an affinity. Like, why am I interested in human nature and not interested in like, physics? Like, I don't know, but like so there is that. And another person that you may or may not have interviewed, but Steve Levitt tells a story of how he became an economist, right? So Steve Levitt is half of the Freakonomics duo of Dubner and Levitt, and Levitt tells a story of how he was a freshman, and he goes to his like Harvard Ec 10 class. I think it was Harvard, and Ec 10 is the intro economics class, and he comes out, and it was like something on like comparative advantage or whatever, and he's walking alongside his classmate or roommate, and they both say almost at the same time like, oh God, that was ridiculous. But then Steve says like, yeah, I mean, everything that was said was so damn obvious. And his friend was like, I couldn't understand anything that he was saying. So the idea of doing things that are playful for you, but drudgery for others, that are maybe easy for you. I actually, in my class, the passion section of my Grit Lab course is called Choose Easy. And then there's another section called Work Hard. But I think that, doing something that was like, yeah, it's like butter. It's like easy, cheesy, lemon squeezy. Plus it's so fun. I mean, choose those paths, walk down them long enough, and learn to work hard.
Talk to me about the 10,000 hour rule. When it comes to working hard, we seem to have this view that, hey, if we just do something for 10,000 hours, we can't help but be successful in it. Does it, to what extent is it the hours versus the reps involved and the immediacy of the feedback too, I would imagine?
Yeah. And you may know that Anders Ericsson passed away this year. Do you know that? Did you know that?
I had heard that. Yeah, I didn't.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This summer. And I will say that it was unexpected and truly tragic. I mean, Anders was in his early 70s, and it was his research, of course, that became paraphrased as the 10,000 hour rule. Anders would want everyone to know that it's nothing about the like magic number 10,000, first of all.
Yeah.
So, that number comes from a single study of German musicians at a music academy where the highest performing musicians had done on average about 10,000 hours of practice. The next most expert group was 5,000, and the group below that, I believe, was like 2,500. But obviously, there's a lot of variation within those groups. And most importantly, Anders would want everyone to know that it's the quality of practice that is really remarkable, because even in the next group down, they were still doing lots of practice. It just was that they had a higher proportion of ineffective practice or less effective practice. In an expert, there are three elements, any of which being missing, then you're not doing deliberate practice in Anders' view. The first is that there's this kind of like hyper intentionality about a very specific weakness or a goal that you're trying to address. The second is that you are really practicing with complete concentration. And many of his research studies, including the ones that I did with him, we measured deliberate practice by whether you were doing practice alone. because
Mm,
that was like a proxy for concentration. And then the third element was feedback, right? And ideally, in most circumstances, immediate feedback. In some circumstances, you could argue that like there's some benefit to a delay, and then the repetition of that cycle. And I think if you ask yourself, how much of my day am I hyper conscious about exactly what I'm trying to do? Like I have a movie in my head of what it
yeah.
looks like before I can do it, and then I'm like practically full concentration. My phone's off, nobody's around, and then I'm getting like immediate feedback, and then I'm going to just do it all again. Like I don't know. There could be days that go by without any deliberate practice,
Yeah.
and so that's I think the magic of what experts do.
That makes sense. I want to come to something you told me earlier, which is 2 weeks ago, you gave a presentation that didn't really go as planned. I want to know what happened and how you talked to yourself in the moment. Like, what was that internal monologue?
So I don't have as many opportunities to like dramatically fail as I did earlier in life, right? Like, I mean, I do fail, and this was a failure, so I want to share it. Like, but it wasn't like a final exam that I like blew and then ended up getting an F in a course. But I had this presentation that I was really excited about on like a new idea in behavior change for me, and I got so excited about it, and I was so confident about how excited everybody else would be about it that I ended up inviting. It was like having a dinner party, inviting like more and more people until like suddenly they hardly can fit into the room. Now in this case it was Zoom, so like everybody fit in the room, but some of my idols like Danny Kahneman, like like very very important political officials, and like anyway, so the party grew, and I made my presentation, which it's sort of like it's like uh, I delivered this presentation like not having ever done it before, and then also not really being good at managing the dynamics of like 100 people on a Zoom call, like some of whom like you would obviously want to say what they thought, as
Right.
opposed to just like monologuing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
70
and
of you shut up, but there's 10 of you I want to hear from. Like,
oh,
yeah.
I mean, it was just really bad. And
Yeah.
right afterwards, I had a call, talk about feedback. So right afterwards, I had a call with one of my collaborators who was in the party. And he said, that was not your best hour. And then told me exactly how it was that was such a, you know, impoverished, experience for everybody, including him. And it was a Friday, and I couldn't sleep. I mean, I was like up all night, replaying things and like writing down notes. And like I literally revised my slides. I mean, I didn't have anyone to give them to, but I just wanted to like rearrange them and like make them right. And then I sent emails to not all 100 people, but like the people I had specifically invited. Um, and I apologized and I was like, that was not a good use of your hour. I was underprepared. I didn't manage the structure or the time well. And I'm sorry. I do like the idea that I presented, but yeah, that was not good. And so I mean, even when I'm at this age with like some successes, like I will tell you, like the emotion of failing, and even something that's not like a final exam or a job interview, but just as trivial as a PowerPoint presentation that you hoped would go well. Man, that emotion just, oof, it stings. I mean, it's horrible. Like I really felt terrible.
Dive into that a little more. Like, how did you speak to yourself in that moment? And then how did you change that conversation?
Well, I'll tell you the self talk that went through my head was like, that was a shit show. Like, I'm humiliated. Like, and then the self talk was very specific, though, right? Like, it was very kind of like, I shouldn't have managed the time that way. I shouldn't have used pull everywhere. I should have rehearsed, right? Now, that self talk is negative, but actually, putting on my psychologist hat again, or my, if I were analyzing that self talk, it's actually productive self talk, because like almost everything that I said was like changeable, right? It's like,
Right.
next time I'll rehearse, next time I won't use pull everywhere for the, like next time I will like, do X, Y, or Z. Now in my 20s, the self talk that I had when I screwed up was very different. And I have all these journals, so I know what the self talk was. I would say things like, I'm bad.
Yeah.
I'm a bad person. And that self talk's really toxic, because you can't really do anything about being just a fundamentally bad person, like whatever that even means. So I have grown up a little bit in the 30 years, since my earlier, young woman failures.
How much of that was planted by that immediate feedback by one of your collaborators who called you and then would probably give you very specific feedback too, right? Versus
40 minutes of it. We had like a
when we're
60-minute
kids, we
hour.
often
Yeah.
don't often get specific feedback. Like I remember when I first started working in my early 20s in an organization, my boss would just be like, that doesn't work. Like, that's no good. But it's like, well, what's no good? Like, what is, you have this vague sense that you're not living up
Yeah.
to expectations, but you're unclear sometimes on what those
Like
expectations
what
are.
to do.
So you reinforce this vague self-talk in a way, and then
yeah. I mean, at the time, let me tell you, I was not appreciating the specificity of the negative feedback, right?
of
And
course,
the
yeah,
dosage of it. Because like after about 5 minutes, I was like, hey, let's talk about something else now. He's like, no,
yeah,
35 more minutes of specific things to say about like how that didn't go well. So I didn't respond well. And you're right that, to answer your question directly, I think I felt especially bad because I immediately got like an avalanche of criticism that was both authoritative um, and detailed and kind of, unvarnished. Um, I probably would have gone to sleep earlier or like slept more soundly if like there had been a little less of it, if it were a little less detailed. But I do think like it was better to have gotten that than a kind of like, hey, it could have gone better. All right, so let's talk about other things,
yeah.
right?
That
Like,
wasn't your best effort, but dinner was
yeah,
great.
but
What'd you think?
but
Yeah,
whatever, like I kind of like
yeah,
this idea, let's talk about. So feedback, as they say, is a gift, but most of us don't know how to unwrap it. Like I will say that it's not a gift that we usually want to receive, like at the moment it's given to us and the way it's given to us. So I think it's a skill to be able to say. And by the way, Shane, I really truly believe that if somebody is eager for feedback, actively solicits feedback, tries to listen to the feedback, learns something from feedback, there you could do anything. Or those are the people I never worry about, right? Like I've had students where they're like really not super socially intelligent, right? I'm like, whoa, not they're not. How do I know? Because other students come and talk to me about them, right? So it's like but if that student is like asking for feedback about how they can improve their, like they're going to be fine. And if you're the opposite of that, then I really worry about you, because then I think like you're never going to be able to fix your own problems. So feedback is magic.
yeah. It's like the world is right, and I need to learn, versus the world is wrong, and I'm just going to keep doing what I'm doing and getting the same results that I've always gotten. I wonder what
Yeah, but I'll
drives
go to
that
sleep. But I'll go to sleep tonight.
right. But I wonder what drives that behavior in terms of I want the feedback, because if you want it from other people, you're probably really open to it from the world too. When it starts giving you feedback that what you're doing is not, which is a lot more vague than when other people are giving you feedback.
I I think so. Is your question like why do some people, or why do I, some on my better days, like why am I eager for that feedback, like from the
Yeah.
world and also from individuals? So I guess I have a first layer answer and a second layer answer. I think the first layer answer is like it's like because I want to learn.
Right.
Like I didn't I want to feel good in the moment, but I more want to learn. Like I'm
Mm.
driven to
Your
improve.
desire to learn overrules feeling good in the moment.
Exactly. Because their intention, right? It's like either I can feel good right now and just get unalloyed praise, or I can learn something that will make me a better presenter and scientist in the future. And I much, the weight is higher for me
Right.
on the learning. So that's the first layer answer, right? That's because of that. But then you can ask the question like, why? Like, why is that? Like, why is that ratio like that for you? But maybe for other people, it's more important to protect their ego, or they want to sleep well on a Friday night. Like, why? And I think for me, the ability to take negative feedback, and I'm not perfect by any means, but like whatever ability I do have, I think does come from a history of mastery or success experiences, right? Like
Mm.
I have been encouraged enough to be a little vulnerable. And in early childhood, there's this idea of secure attachment. Have you heard of like attachment theory?
Mm-hmm.
So for those, I guess, who are less, familiar, this is the idea that young children, around, really like toddler age, right? They are attached to their primary caregiver, often their mother, but not necessarily. And there are different styles of attachment. And the attachment style you really want is called the secure attachment style. And then there are various forms of insecure attachment. And the reason why this became so important in developmental psychology, it was the idea that like whatever your attachment style was going to be, it was going to be like pretty influential in terms of like how you would like have other future relationships in your life. And the thing to note about the secure attachment style is that because the child has security, they actually so you imagine a mother in a room and they have their toddler child. If that is a secure attachment, then the behavior of the child, say in a new room with new toys, is not going to be to cling to the mother. It is because the child is attached that they will venture, even 5-10 feet away from where the mother is sitting and pick up a new toy and then maybe run back and make sure mom's there. But and so I think I am, as whatever I have that's like, okay, I can handle this criticism, it is probably because I've had enough mastery experiences to feel secure.
I think that's a really important place, right? You feel this safety so that you can take these risks, including learning and knowing that it doesn't change who you are, it doesn't change the relationships in your life, it's just making you better.
And if your kid is like driving you nuts because they are not taking risks and they seem to be, afraid of failure, and that, by the way, that sometimes looks like laziness, right? Even though it's underneath the surface, not at all laziness. Ask yourself, like, maybe they are not confident because they haven't had a string of experiences to make them confident, right? So here again, the person versus the situation. Like maybe your underconfident child, which is a person, is that way because of series of situations. And then you have to think of, and all of the great coaches and teachers do this. You kind of just like engineer these, small wins where, you make things like bite size enough that there can be a few at bats and a few hits.
I like that notion. Do you have personal rules, routines, or habits for success? And what I mean by that is I like to think that there's these automatic rules that we can adapt for ourselves that put us on the path to success to help us get what we want out of life. And without getting into what we want out of life, I'm curious as to exploring what those habits, routines, or rules that you have are.
I've been actually researching that a little bit, right? Personal rules. So personal rules are like I never or I always. That's what a personal rule is. Not a kind of like, well, sometimes or often, but like, some people might have a personal rule. Actually, my editor for my the only book I ever wrote. So Rick had a rule of going to the gym every day without missing a single, no matter what. I'm not exactly sure how he adapted that rule in the pandemic, but so always never rules are really interesting to me, and they are related. They're kind of in the same family as like habits, because they are these sort of like you're not thinking about it, you're not deliberating, you're just doing, right? And the reason I'm studying it is because I do think that very successful people have usually a small number of like fairly inviolable rules and also habits. And by the way, why is that, right? Like, there are downsides like inflexibility and that's probably the biggest one, right? So why do people have these rules and habits when there's so much to be lost by having them in a way, right? The reason I think is twofold. So Colin Camerer at Caltech, who's a collaborator, would say that the biggest reason, I think you have to ask him, but I think Colin would say that the biggest reason why we have habits is that they put us on autopilot and they free up cognitive resources for other things.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, if every time you had to like, cut yourself, like grapefruit, you had to like devote all of your energy to like, first I lift my wrist, then I clench my fist around the knife. It's like, no, it's like there are things that can like run on autopilot, like cut the grapefruit. Okay, I know how to do that. And habits are like that. There's another reason I think Colin would agree with me that habits actually are a self-control device. So if you are doing something as a matter of habit, like exercising or eating a salad for lunch or writing thank you notes or doing other things which are good for you and others in the long run, but maybe not the funnest, easiest thing to do in the short run, being on autopilot is a very good thing for that. So it's not just so that we can free up cognitive resources to do calculus, right? It's also because many of the things about which we have habits and rules are self-control dilemmas where the immediate alternative is just better.
Yeah.
So a lot of people, like I have a habit of checking my email after dinner. That's one. So why do I have that habit? I have that habit in part because I don't want to check my email all day because like that would make for a lot of email checking and not a lot of thought about behavioral science, right? So there's that. The second thing is that when it's after dinner, I mean, I could watch like reruns of Downton Abbey. I could, like just like scroll through Twitter. I could do all these things. Now, those things are all going to be like a little bit more fun for me than email. But if I make it a rule or a habit that like after dinner, I check my email always, then that kind of does an end run around the temptation. So that's one of the habits I have. I also have a habit of doing exercise at 6 p.m. Eastern time. I have a habit of every time I do a public talk, I have a habit of sending a thank you email because I think it's the right thing to do. And as your producers know, there's like a lot of back end stuff that somebody had to do to make that possible. And I think it's the right thing to do to show some appreciation. And I always ask for feedback. So I always ask, like, what's one thing that I might not know about that I could do better? And half the time I get some negative feedback. Half the time there's like, it was great. It's like they just can't bring themselves to say an unkind word. But those are all habits that I have found to be very useful.
Just coming back to the rules versus habits or choices, maybe we'll just broaden it to rules versus choices. There's a huge difference between somebody who's on a diet and somebody who doesn't eat dessert.
Yes.
Right? Because if you're on a diet, you're making these choices all the time. But if you don't eat dessert, it's a rule. You just don't eat. You don't have to make a choice. And Daniel Kahneman told me this in our conversation, actually, for the podcast, where he said nobody argues with rules. He's like,
he's the reason I started studying rules. Because like I just noticed when we were in conversation, he'd be like, well, I have a rule. I don't make a decision on the phone.
Yeah.
And then he would say like, well, I have a rule. Like I don't blur books unless I read them in entirety and have a personal relationship with the topic or the author. And I was like, wait, Danny Kahneman does it. Dan Gilbert does it. Like, what's up with these personal rules? So I will say this too, in the small amount of research I've done, because we randomly assign people to, for example, set a rule about how many steps they were going to take. And, these are Fitbit users that we had recruited because they already had a Fitbit. And then we had other conditions where you just set a goal and various control conditions. We did not find a benefit of setting a kind of always never rule. Like I always make 10,000 steps, right? And I'm guessing that one reason is that even though for Danny Kahneman, certain rules can be certainly adaptive, there are some downsides to rules, like when you don't make your rule, like you can have the what the hell effect.
Yeah.
So I think that the rule on rules is probably that you should make up your own rules as opposed to like somebody exogenously handing you one.
Yeah.
And making you adhere to it.
You have to think for yourself, what are the rules that are likely to put me on the path to success? But I think about that in multiple ways, right? There's lifestyle rules, which is you want to get enough sleep, you want to eat healthy, what are the rules that you can create around that help you just go on autopilot? It could be your alarm going off at 9:30 on your iPhone going like, now it's time to wind down and go to bed. Why am I doing that? I'm doing that because that puts me in the best position to succeed tomorrow at work. And then you have these rules about the type of person you want to become. What would that person behave like in these given situations, right? So you have an identity-based rule system where it's like, I want to be a better person. I want to be a better spouse. I want to be what would a better version of me, or what is the best version of me look like in these moments? So you have these business rules, you sort of have these life rules, and then you have these personal. Well, I'm curious as to your take on that.
Yeah, the other reason I became fascinated with rules is I read this essay once by James March, who was a brilliant and iconoclastic and interdisciplinary thinker, and he said there's two kinds of logic that we can use to make choices.
Hmm.
There's the logic of consequence,
Hmm.
and then there's the logic of appropriateness. So the logic of consequence is like basically cost benefit analyses, right? It's like thinking like an economist, like
Yeah.
we should buy a new house. Do you know this essay, by the way? Like,
No, I'm familiar with March though, but I don't remember this one.
yeah. So he's written so much. They're like, but anyway, you can Google March logic of consequence, and I think
Okay.
it'll come up. Um, so these are the kinds of things that economists think we do all the time, and to some extent, even if it's at a non-conscious level, we do. Like their expected value decisions, and much of our conversation has been about that, right? Like, why do people, why are they ambitious? Like, why do they give up, etc. But Marx said there's a kind of logic that we apply in many situations that has nothing to do with calculating costs and benefits and probabilities. And it's the logic of appropriateness. And he said, when you are operating according to logic consequence, the three questions are what are the costs? What are the benefits? What are the probabilities? When you are operating according to the logic of appropriateness, the three questions are what situation is this?
Hmm.
Who am I? What does someone like me do in a situation like this? Right. And so this is all about identity, right? So imagine that you are like me, a tired mother, working mother who has a teenager at home, right? And your kid is doing something that's totally annoying, like whatever. In my case, like asking you demandingly, like whether dinner could be ready in 4 minutes, right? So there's this kind of like cost benefit probability thing. It's like, what are the benefits of, responding in a kind way? What are the costs to me of responding? What are the probabilities that like that outcome is good? Or like, what situation is this? Like my daughter is being grumpy. Who am I? I am a mother. What does a mother do when a child is grumpy? A mother is kind, right?
Mm.
And so I've been kind of fascinated by like the logic of appropriateness, the importance of identity, and I do think that much of our life is, trying to basically, if Shakespeare said that all the world's a stage and each of us its players, much of our lives we're like, what role am I in? Like, oh, I'm the doctor. Okay, I'll do that, right? Like,
Yeah.
oh, I'm the whiny child. Okay, I'll do that, and we step into that role and we play it out.
I think that's a great place to end this, Angela. I want to thank you so much for a fascinating conversation.
Shane, I loved this conversation. Thank you for having me.